Some people don't just daydream. They build entire alternate lives inside their head. A penthouse apartment, luxury cars, millions of followers, being admired, being envied, walking into rooms and instantly becoming the most important person there. And strangely, these fantasies usually appear during the most ordinary moments. While lying in bed, while listening to music, while staring out a car window, during class, during work, during lonely nights when reality feels painfully small. Psychology has always been fascinated by this type of mind, because excessive fantasies about wealth, status, and extreme success usually aren't just about money. They're about emotional escape. For many people, these fantasies begin during periods of powerlessness, a life where they feel ignored, undervalued, ordinary, emotionally trapped, or deeply dissatisfied with who they currently are. So the brain creates a compensating identity, an imagined version of themselves that finally receives everything reality never gave them: attention, respect, validation, freedom, control. That's why these fantasies often feel so addictive. The brain doesn't fully separate imagined reward from real emotional reward. When someone imagines becoming massively successful, the brain can release dopamine, the same chemical connected to motivation and pleasure, which means the fantasy itself becomes emotionally rewarding. And over time, some people unconsciously become attached to the feeling of future success more than the process required to actually reach it. That's why many chronic dreamers constantly imagine the outcome, but rarely visualize the boring middle, the sleepless nights, the repetition, the humiliation, the years of uncertainty. The fantasy skips directly to the applause. Psychologists sometimes call this compensatory fantasizing. When reality feels emotionally insufficient, the imagination overcorrects. A person who feels invisible imagines becoming famous. A person who feels weak imagines becoming powerful. A person who feels rejected imagines becoming desired by everyone. And social media has made this even more intense. Every day, young minds consume endless images of wealth, beauty, influence, and status. Private jets, perfect bodies, luxury lifestyles, self-made millionaires. The brain slowly starts treating extraordinary success as normal. And once ordinary life begins feeling emotionally unacceptable, fantasy becomes a coping mechanism. But here's where it gets deeper. Many people who obsess over becoming rich aren't actually obsessed with money itself. They're obsessed with what money represents psychologically: safety, freedom, importance, revenge, finally proving something. For some, wealth fantasies are secretly tied to old emotional wounds. Being underestimated as a child, feeling powerless growing up, watching others get respected while they felt ignored. Success becomes more than a goal. It becomes emotional redemption, a way to finally silence every insecurity they carry. That's why some people fantasize less about owning money and more about being seen having money, being admired online, being desired, making old classmates jealous, walking into places and finally feeling superior. At that point, the fantasy is no longer financial. It's psychological status repair. And the scary part is, these imagined futures can become so emotionally satisfying that real life starts feeling unbearably dull in comparison. Normal progress feels too slow. Normal jobs feel humiliating. Normal achievement feels meaningless. Some people become trapped between grand imagination and passive action, always imagining the future version of themselves, but slowly disconnecting from the present version that actually needs discipline. And yet, not all of this is negative. Almost every ambitious person begins as a dreamer. Big visions can create motivation. They can help people survive painful environments. They can create hope during emotionally empty periods of life. The problem begins when fantasy replaces execution, when imagining success becomes a substitute for building it. Because psychologically, the brain can become confused. Talking about goals, imagining goals, watching motivational content, visualizing wealth. All of these things can create tiny emotional rewards before any real achievement happens, which sometimes tricks people into feeling productive without actually moving. Real success is repetitive, quiet, uncomfortable, embarrassing sometimes. But fantasy success is instant, perfect, cinematic. That's why the mind prefers it. And deep down, many of these people aren't lazy. They're emotionally attached to a future version of themselves because the current version feels difficult to accept. The fantasy becomes self-soothing. a temporary escape from insecurity, loneliness, boredom, disappointment, or fear. For some people, daydreaming about extreme success is actually the mind whispering. One day life will finally feel meaningful. But meaning can't survive only inside imagination. At some point, fantasy has to collide with reality. Otherwise, a person slowly becomes addicted to the emotional high of someday. And years disappear that way. Not because they lacked intelligence, not because they lacked potential, but because imagining greatness felt safer than risking failure in reality.